Justice was supposed to bring order to the frontier, but in Lincoln County, justice had worn itself thin, stretched so tight between profit and pride that it finally tore. What filled the gap wasn't peace, it was silence, the kind that comes before a shot. The lawmen had turned merchants, the merchants had turned generals, and the courts had become another kind of battlefield. By the summer of 1878, the only truth left standing in Lincoln was that everyone believed they were right, and that belief had become permission to kill. Out here, justice didn't wear robes or carry scales. It rode on horseback, carried a badge when it suited, and a rifle when it didn't. Men wrote their arguments in lead and let the wind carry their verdicts, and in that wind, the sound of reason disappeared. The people of Lincoln lived like they were waiting for something. A trial, a reckoning, a change that never came. They built their town on promises that had already gone bankrupt. And by the time the summer heat settled in, so had mercy. The war was coming, but not the kind that earns a headline or a hero. It would start with barricaded doors, end with burned walls, and leave behind nothing clean enough to call justice. Hey Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hey, John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's Friday.
It is Friday.
It's Friday before a holiday week.
Yeah.
That's got to be good news.
Yeah.
Really?
Wasn't very convincing, was it?
Not terribly at all, no.
Yay!
Very.
How about that?
That's
okay.
Better. All right, so you ready to dive into this next segment of Billy the Kid's saga?
Let's figure it out.
All right, the war is kicking off tonight.
The war is kicking off. Okay.
I mean, like the 5-day battle, the big one kicks off.
Ah, the big one. Okay.
So when you spend long enough studying the Lincoln County War, you start to wonder if it was ever really about land or cattle, or if it was about pride wearing a badge. This episode isn't just another gunfight story. It's the first day that the law decided to burn down with the town.
5 days, dozens of men, and a single street that turned into a battlefield. Lincoln wasn't a town anymore. It was a verdict waiting to be carried out. Everyone inside those walls, McSween, Billy, the Regulators, the house, they were all trapped in the same place, each convinced justice was on their side.
And the truth is, by that summer, justice was gone. What replaced it was survival, and the kind of loyalty that only shows itself when you've got nowhere left to run. This is where the legend of Billy the Kid stopped being rumor and started becoming history.
But as always, before we start, make sure you're following Dark Dialogue, Gallows, and Gunfights wherever you listen. Leave a rating, tap the thumbs up, and share it with anyone who still believes the West was built on truth. John would like you to think otherwise. You can join the Dark Dialogue Collective, our boots on the ground network supporting real-world investigations and historical preservation at darkdialogue.com. If you'd like to adopt a victim, support us on Patreon or Ko-fi, or get behind-the-scenes case files on Substack, it's all there too. And if you've got questions, tips, or just want to talk history or, smack John around a little bit, email us at info@darkdialogue.com.
This is Dark Dialogue, Gallows, and Gunfights, where we let the past take the stand and the guilty face the gallows. The road to Lincoln's final battle began long before the first shots of July. It began with 2 deaths in the spring, Frank McNabb and Manuel Segovia, and with them, the last breath of restraint in a county already drowning in blood. When Frank McNabb was ambushed outside the Fritz Ranch on April 29, 1878, the Regulators lost more than a captain. They lost their balance. McNabb had been steady, cautious, the kind of man who held the younger riders back from suicide by pride. His killers Bob Beckwith, Dutch Charlie Kruling, and Manuel Segovia, among the Seven Rivers warriors, left his body in the dust and his men in shock. Ab Saunders was cut down in that same attack, so badly wounded he'd never ride again. Frank Coe was taken prisoner, later escaping under circumstances that still read more like rumor than rescue. What mattered was how it felt. Another leader gone, another funeral without answers. Even those loyal to McSween whispered that the war had crossed into something darker, a contest that no longer recognized mercy. 2 weeks later, May the 15th, the Regulators found Manuel Segovia near Seven Rivers and settled the account their own way. There was no warrant, no pretense of law, only bullets. Segovia fell where he stood, shot down in the open. His death was vengeance for McNabb, pure and simple, and with it, every illusion of legality burned away. From that moment on, no one in Lincoln County expected arrest or trial, only reprisal. Through May and June, Lincoln County turned into a maze of fear. Regulators struck at Seven Rivers outposts, burned ranches, and hunted known allies of the House. In return, Murphy-Dolan's riders, Seven Rivers men, remnants of the Jesse Evans and John Kinney gangs, returned the favor in kind. Families were harassed, travelers ambushed, and every isolated ranch became a question mark on the horizon. Men like Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, and Chavez E. Chavez hardened fast, their days measured in raids and nights by who didn't come back. What began as vigilante justice blurred into organized banditry. Every killing was branded revenge for another, and every excuse sounded righteous in the moment. The civilians paid the price. Neutral ranches were stripped bare, livestock stolen by both sides. Some families vanished in the night, loading wagons from Mesilla or Fort Stanton, leaving only smoke behind. Lincoln County's map grew quieter, emptier, deadlier. The shooting wasn't the only front. In the courtrooms, the House tightened its grip. Allies in Santa Fe filled juries, bought signatures, and turned every indictment into a weapon. The result was predictable. Only Regulators were charged. Only McSween's men were fugitives. The same courthouse that had absolved Dolan's killers now branded Billy the Kid a murderer. Meanwhile, McSween supporters fought back with telegrams and petitions. Letters went out begging for federal inquiry, for the U.S. Army to step in before the county tore itself apart. The paper trail would later summon Colonel Nathan Dudley and his soldiers to Lincoln, a promise of order that arrived too late and in the wrong uniform. Every attempt to restore lawful government failed. The sheriff's badge belonged to one faction, the judges to another, and Lincoln County justice had become just another franchise. By June, the war had eaten its conscience. Respected men were gone, replaced by boys too young to remember what peace had looked like. Rumors spread of lists, names marked for death on both sides, and no one rode unarmed. Inside the Regulators, grief curdled into fatalism. They'd buried Brewer, McNabb, and a score of friends in 2 months. Doc Scurlock, now captain, held the remnants together through discipline and prayer, but every man understood the odds. Each sunrise might be their last. Within Murphy-Dolan's house, the fear was just as thick. Storefronts became bunkers, windows were boarded, ammunition stockpiled. The once prosperous business block now looked like a garrison waiting on the siege that everyone knew was coming. By early July, Lincoln was no longer a town. It was an armed camp. Caldwell House, Dolan's store, and McSween's Adobe all bristled with gunmen. Fresh recruitments arrived from Texas, from the Rio Grande, and from anywhere a man could earn by killing. Each side had dug in, certain that the next exchange would decide everything. The spring of 1878 had stripped away every disguise the war once wore. No lawmen, no outlaws, only survivors. By the early summer of 1878, the war in Lincoln County had entered its strangest phase, a moment when the law itself became the weapon. The Regulators who fought to enforce justice, now justice had sworn out warrants for their arrest. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff George Peppin held the badge, but his oath ran to the House. He filled his posse with Seven Rivers men, Dolan riders, and hired killers who treated legal authority like another form of firepower. Behind them stood the Santa Fe Ring, men like Thomas Catrone and District Attorney William Reinerson, who made sure every indictment cut only one way. The murder dockets told the story. Morton, Baker, Brady, Hinman, Chapman, Roberts, every killing tied to the Regulators appeared before a grand jury, while the crimes of the Dolan faction disappeared into ink and influence. By summer's turn, warrants named nearly every Regulator alive. Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, Fred Waite, Charlie Bowdry, Tom O'Phalliard, and even Alexander McSween himself. They weren't vigilantes anymore. They were outlaws by decree. With prices on their heads and warrants on their back, the Regulators vanished into the wild country. The Capitans, the Rio Ruidoso, and the Mescalero Divide. They slept under pines, kept fires low, and rode only by night. Not long before, they had carried commissions signed by Justice of the Peace John Wilson, paper that made them lawmen. Then Governor Samuel Axtell tore those papers apart with one proclamation, revoking every writ and deputation. Yesterday's posse had become today's hunted men. They moved in small bands, always armed, always ready for betrayal. Each knock on a ranch door could be a friend, food, or a firing squad. This was the moment the Regulators stopped chasing justice and started running from it. Even in exile, Alexander McSween kept fighting on paper. He cleared his name of the Emil Fritz insurance embezzlement charges, a victory that proved what everyone already knew, that the war had begun not in the streets, but in the ledgers. At the same time, McSween's allies managed to secure indictments against James Dolan and John Riley for cattle theft and conspiracy in Tunstall's murder. But justice in Lincoln County had two doors, one for the House, which always stayed open, and one for its enemies, which stayed barred. Dolan and Riley walked free through the town while McSween hid like a thief in the brush. Legal parity existed only on paper, and paper burned easily in New Mexico wind. It was during this exile that a new name rode into the story, Tom O'Phalliard. He was young, loyal, and fast with a horse, the kind of man who made a fight feel less lonely. Drawn to the Regulators around the time that Segovia fell, he soon became Billy's closest friend, a brother in every way that mattered. O'Phalliard's arrival steadied the campfires, gave the fugitives something like family again, and forged the brotherhood that would carry them through the coming siege. By June's end, Lincoln County had no law that anyone trusted. The courts were corrupt, the badges compromised, the oaths forgotten. What came next wasn't justice, it was inevitability. When the smoke finally rose above Lincoln in July, it would mark not just the burning of a town, but the last trial the West ever held without a jury. By July of 1878, Lincoln County was a town waiting for judgment. The Regulators lost their captains, their legal authority, and half their friends. Every rancher had chosen a side. Every lawman had sold his soul, and still, justice hadn't come. The men who had sworn oaths to protect the law were now hunted by it. The men who'd murdered in daylight were now sitting behind desks, giving orders under seal. It was a county split clean down the middle, half fear, half fury, and Alexander McSween was about to ride back into its heart. McSween had spent months as a fugitive, hiding from arrest warrants written by the very men who'd ruined him. But the lawyer-turned-insurgent still believed he could fight this war with a pen, or at least die standing in his own house. With his wife Susan holding the line in Lincoln and every legal remedy exhausted, McSween made a fateful choice: to go home. He would return to Lincoln, not as an outlaw, but as a citizen reclaiming his name, even if it meant walking straight into a crossfire. On the evening of July 14, 1878, just after nightfall, the procession began, a caravan of conviction and desperation moving quietly toward the town. It wasn't just the ironclad Regulators this time, it was an army. Among the riders were Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, Charlie Bowdry, Tom O'Phalliard, and Jim French, the hardened nucleus of a cause long past saving. But there were new faces too. Martin Chavez, a rancher from San Patricio, and 24 Hispano allies who had watched the house choke up every scrap of independence in the valley. They came for loyalty, for vengeance, for survival, and for the faint chance that if they stood together, Lincoln might still belong to its people. When they rode into town that night, their numbers swelled near 60, a force the Regulators hadn't seen since the war began. It was an uneven company, veterans and volunteers, gunslingers and ranch hands, each one bound to the others by the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run. McSween's public statement was that he had come home to reclaim his property, but everyone knew better. It wasn't about deeds or documents anymore. It was about defiance, and it was about time. Across the street, James Dolan and John Riley wasted no time. They fortified Montano's store, called for their allies, and sent word for Sheriff George Peppin, who arrived with deputies and hired gunmen, many from the Seven Rivers and the Kinney gangs. By dawn, both sides had dug in. Lincoln was now two fortresses staring each other down across a single dusty street. Some townsfolk fled before the first shot. Others stayed, boarding their windows, clutching rosaries, waiting for the war to decide who owned their town. By the early hours of July 15th, rifles were loaded, pickets posted, and both armies were watching the horizon for the signal to begin. For McSween and his men, this was the last stand of belief. That if they could hold the town, even for a day, they could prove they'd never been the criminals history tried to make them. But to Dolan's house, this wasn't a matter of politics anymore. It was property, profit, and pride, and they would burn Lincoln to ash before surrendering an inch of it. What happened next wasn't justice or law or even revenge. It was inevitability. When the sun rose on July 15, 1878, the 5-day Battle of Lincoln began, and with it, the death of the Lincoln County War's last illusion that anyone was still fighting for what was right. When Alexander McSween and the Regulators rode back into Lincoln, they didn't come to hide. They came to fortify. Every step, every building seized was part of a plan to dig in before the house and Sheriff Peppin's men could choke them out. What followed was the transformation of a frontier village into a battlefield. The Regulators moved fast. Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, Tom Fowler, Jim French, Chavez, E. Chavez, and nearly 60 armed men spread through the town like a wave of intent. At the east end, they claimed the McSween house, a 2-story adobe brick whose thick walls and elevated windows made it the perfect stronghold. Farther west, the Tunstall store and its corrals were barricaded, barrels and crates stacked chest high. Those two buildings formed a line of overlapping fire, close enough that riders could dash between them under cover. The Ellis house, friendly to McSween's cause, was occupied next. Together with the Montano store, these posts created a fortified spine down Lincoln's single street, a defense line of adobe and nerve. Riflemen took the upper windows, sharpshooters perched behind loopholes in the rooftops. From dawn's first light, the strait was watched by a dozen muzzles that never blinked. Not every man loyal to the house made it back to safety. Deputies Jack Long and Billy Matthews, caught in the open with several others, found themselves cut off. They sprinted for the Torreón, the old Spanish stone tower that stood like a sentinel opposite the Montano store. Its walls were 3 feet thick, its slits made for rifles instead of light. When the Regulators sealed the street, the men inside were trapped. Long and Matthews shouted for help, but anyone bold enough to answer met a rain of fire from the Tunstall store and the Montano windows. For the first time that morning, the house found itself besieged in its own town. With the Torreón cut off and McSween's men dug in, Lincoln became a patchwork of rival fortresses. The Regulators controlled the eastern and central blocks. Dolan's fighters clung to the western end and the courthouse area. Between them stretched a gauntlet of dust, bullets, and fear. Every corner was a potential ambush. Every rooftop held a rifle. Civilians dove for cellars, clutching children as gunfire skipped down the street. Throughout the day, volleys cracked back and forth, testing defenses. Each side probed for weaknesses, but neither dared a full assault, both waiting for reinforcements, rumored to be on the road. Peppin's posse, the Seven Rivers Warriors, and John Kinney's hired guns. By late morning, Lincoln was no longer a town. It was a map of strongholds separated by open ground. The line between law and outlaw blurred into smoke and grit. News of McSween's return hit Sheriff George Peppin and James Dolan like a spark to powder. Peppin, a House loyalist freshly installed as sheriff, wasted no time. He sent riders in every direction, summoning John Kinney, Marion Turner, Buck Powell, and the infamous Jesse Evans gang. Within hours, the number swelled to about 40 armed men, not ranch hands or deputies, but hardened professionals. These were men who had lived through the range wars and the killings from Tularosa to Texas. They didn't come for justice. They came to finish the Regulators. Peppin made his headquarters in the Wortley Hotel and the House, the old Murphy-Dolan store. Both buildings commanded the heart of Lincoln's Main Street, perfect ground for snipers, scouts, and the staging of an assault. From there, he began the encirclement. Men were posted on rooftops and behind adobe corners. Others took the high ground overlooking the town. Every alley became a firing line. The goal was clear: trap McSween, starve him, and crush the Regulators' stand before it could spread into open rebellion. When the reinforcements arrived, gunfire followed. The House men opened fire on the McSween house and the fortified stores. Smoke rolled down the street as rifle cracks echoed between the buildings. The siege of Lincoln had officially begun. A handful of Peppin's gunmen went down early, hit by return fire from the portholes. Inside their adobe walls, the Regulators shouted orders and held steady. It was an uneven fight, 40 against 60, but every man knew this battle would not be settled by numbers, but by nerve. By nightfall, Lincoln was sealed in smoke and silence. No side yet yielded ground, but the lines were drawn, the defenses tested, and the war that would make legends had begun. By the time the sun set on July 14, 1878, Lincoln was no longer waiting for a fight. It was surrounded by one. The Regulators held the east and the center of town. Dolan and Peppin's loyalists were amassing on the western rise, and riding hard into the darkness came the killers who would light the fuse. John Kinney's men out of Las Cruces, Marion Turner's posse, Buck Powell's cowhands, and the unpredictable, deadly Jesse Evans gang. They were seasoned fighters, men who traded law for pay long before Lincoln ever heard of justice. When they arrived, they didn't hesitate. Before the dust of their horses had settled, they opened fire on the McSween house. Their first volley marked the point of no return, a sound that turned a political feud into open war. The opening shots left the Regulators split across multiple strongholds. From the Montano house, Billy the Kid saw the trap closing in. He knew if McSween's home fell, the war ended there, with them buried inside it. So he ran. With Tom Fowler, Jim French, and several others at his side, Billy sprinted across open ground as bullets hissed through the dark. A slug tore splinters from a hitching post. Another smashed through a shutter inches from his head. But somehow, miraculously, they reached the McSween house alive, slamming the heavy door behind them as the next volley struck the wall like hail. The dash through Lincoln's night cemented the battle lines. Peppin's men tightening the ring from the west, the Regulators barricaded in the east, and between them, the town's single street, a strip of dust that would soon become a graveyard. All through the darkness, the exchange never stopped. Rifles cracked from doorways, pistols flared from rooftops, and the smell of black powder drifted like a storm across the valley. Both sides fortified by lantern light. Dolan's gunmen dug in behind wagons and adobe walls. Inside McSween's home, defenders tore up floorboards for firing ports and braced the doors with barrels. Every man knew the morning would bring the real fight, a siege that would only end one way. Daybreak, Monday, July 15, 1878. The dawn came to Lincoln under the shadow of loaded rifles. The exchange of fire the night before had ended any illusion of restraint. Now, both sides faced the new day with grim resolve, the first full light of the siege. Inside the McSween house, men moved with quiet urgency. Every piece of furniture became a barrier. Mattresses, feed sacks, and crates were piled waist-high against the windows. Anything that could slow a bullet found a place in the walls. Across the street, the Tunstall store and the smaller allied adobes were fortified the same way. Ranch hands and gunmen turned living rooms into parapets and kitchens into firing lines. What had been a merchant's village only days before was now a barricaded grid of dust, sweat, and gun oil. Many of the regulators, men raised in the saddle and familiar with adobe, took to the walls with tools in hand. Axes, shovels, even butcher knives carved narrow portholes through the clay. Each slit offered a new angle down the street, a safe place to rest a rifle, a window without exposure. By mid-morning, McSween home and its neighbors had become a chain of miniature forts, each linked by sightline and purpose. From rooftops, Doc Scurlock, Billy the Kid, and Jim French surveyed the street below. The house gunmen, Peppin's deputies, and hired mercenaries answered from the Wortley Hotel, the house store, and every darkened doorway they could claim. With each shot, adobe dust drifted through the sunbeams like smoke from a dying fire. Even amid the thunder of rifles, Alexander McSween still tried to wage a legal battle. Inside his barricaded home, clerks and loyalists scribbled out affidavits, petitions to the territorial courts and to the army at Fort Stanton, pleading for intervention, for recognition, for anything resembling law. It was a desperate act of faith in a system already weaponized against them. Outside, the only petitions being filed came from Winchester barrels. By late morning, sniper fire swept Lincoln's single street. Men couldn't show a hat brim without drawing a dozen shots. One regulator fell out a window. Another was grazed crossing from house to house. Each impact was met with answering fire from behind the sandbags. Steady, disciplined, fatal. As the sun reached its zenith, the day's grim choreography settled in. The regulators, vastly outnumbered but anchored in the east end of town, refused every shouted offer to surrender. They would hold their ground whatever the cost. Across the way, Peppin's men, reinforced by Dolan's hired guns and Seven Rivers fighters, tightened their perimeter. They had numbers, rifles, and time, and they intended to bleed the defenders into silence. By midday, Lincoln's main street was no longer a place, but a condition, a strip of no man's land where the living whispered beside the dead. Civilians huddled in cellars, horses bolted through crossfire, and in the thick heat of July, the first day of the siege settled into its rhythm, a war of patience, bullets, and sheer endurance. By the second morning of gunfire in Lincoln, Alexander McSween was fighting on more than one front. The bullets outside his walls were only half the battle. The rest came in the form of paper, pen, and principle, because in the chaos of that siege, even the line between neighbor and enemy could shift overnight. Across the street from the McSween house, the stone-walled Torreón still sheltered a handful of Dolan's men, cut off, trapped, but not starving. Somehow, food, water, and messages were slipping through the lines. McSween soon discovered the reason. Saturnino Baca, a respected Hispano landowner whose home stood only a few doors away, had become an unwitting supply line. Bread, water, and whispers moved through his doorway. It wasn't open treason, it was survival. But in the fever of that week, survival for one side meant death for the other. McSween's patience snapped. He sat at his desk amid the stacked sandbags and the muffled boom of rifles and wrote a letter to Saturnino Baca. It was not polite nor legalistic. It was personal. Quote, "You have allowed your house to become a refuge for murderers for the purpose of taking my life. You will vacate your property within 3 days, or I will consider it a legitimate target." End quote. In that moment, McSween, lawyer, churchman, and husband, became a commander issuing a military threat. The siege had forced him to abandon the courtroom for the code of war. But inside the Baca home, the reality was crueler than McSween knew. Mrs. Baca had given birth just the day before. The house smelled of gunpowder and new life. The midwife hadn't yet left when the next volley rattled the windows. Leaving was not an option. Staying meant living between two firing lines. Saturnino Baca faced the impossible: defy the regulators and risk annihilation, or aid the house and be branded a traitor to his own people. Either way, someone's bullet already had his name on it. With his wife and newborn still inside, Baca dictated a desperate letter to Colonel Nathan Dudley, commander at Fort Stanton. He begged for soldiers to intervene to save his family, or at least bear witness before his house became a battlefield. But Dudley's hands were tied. The freshly passed Posse Comitatus Act forbade federal troops from interfering in civil disputes.
There's a word.
The Posse Comitatus Act?
Oh, shit.
You don't know that one?
No.
Yeah, that's the one that's all over the news right now with the National Guard being used in cities. Everybody's saying that it's violating the Posse Comitatus Act.
I think you're just throwing darts at letters in the alphabet. And
yeah, well, maybe so. All Dudley could do, that's fine. All Dudley could do was send Lieutenant Daniel Appel to observe. No relief, no escort, just observation. The law, meant to restrain federal overreach, had now abandoned a woman in childbirth to the mercy of warring gunmen. The Baca confrontation captured everything the 5-day battle had become. There were no longer civilians, only victims waiting to be claimed by one banner or another. Property, ethnicity, allegiance, all twisted together in a town that no longer recognized the word neutral. What began as a letter became a microcosm of the war itself. Law turned threat, neighbor turned enemy, and mercy lost beneath the roar of gunfire. As the standoff deepened and threats spread from house to house, Santurnino Baca made one final attempt to save his family from the storm closing around them. His letter to Colonel Nathan Dudley at Fort Stanton begged for protection. At Fort Stanton, Colonel Dudley faced an impossible choice. The new Posse Comitatus Act barred soldiers from stepping into civilian disputes.
I'm sorry.
I can't believe you have never heard
No.
that before.
I don't know why it's so funny, but damn, that's the word.
To march armed men into Lincoln without federal orders would risk his command and ignite a political scandal that would outlast the war itself. But doing nothing meant letting civilians die within riding distance of his post. So Dudley chose the narrowest path available. He sent Lieutenant Daniel Appel, his post surgeon, to investigate. Appel carried no troops, no orders, and no weapons, only the authority of his uniform and the faint hope that reason might still hold. When Appel reached Lincoln, the air itself seemed alive with tension. Men on both sides had dug in behind adobe walls. The McSween house bristled with rifle portholes. The Montano store was alive with defenders, and across the street, Dolan's men crouched inside the Torreón, firing bursts and shouting defiance. Appel moved carefully between the lines, a single unarmed man in the no man's land of Main Street. He met with Santurnino Baca, who described his family's peril. The weak mother, the newborn, the stray bullets that struck the walls each hour. From there, Appel went to McSween, who stood firm. He would not leave again, and he would not tolerate any house that aided his enemies. Finally, Appel reached the Torreón, speaking through its narrow slits to Jack Long, Billy Matthews, and the others inside. They told him they'd surrender only if U.S. troops occupied the tower and made it neutral ground. 3 sides, 3 truths, and not a single law that could reconcile them. Appel brokered a fragile understanding. The Baca home and the Torreón would remain untouched as soldiers could claim them as neutral ground, and both fractions would hold fire while civilians remained inside. McSween agreed in principle. Dolan's men agreed in desperation, but the army could not act, and neutrality meant little to men who'd already buried too many friends. Appel rode back to Fort Stanton with his report, his mission technically complete, his purpose entirely unfulfilled. Behind him, Lincoln's gunfire resumed, measured and relentless, as Sheriff Peppin's reinforcements began to filter in from the west. The Torreón still held. The Baca family still hid behind adobe walls, and the law, once again, had arrived too late to matter. When word reached Sheriff Peppin that McSween and the Regulators had seized half of Lincoln's Main Street, the time for cautious law-keeping was over. By the morning of July 15th, Peppin wasn't a peace officer anymore. He was a field commander in a war for the town itself. Peppin moved fast. He planted his flag inside the 2 buildings that had anchored the house since the feud began. the Wortley Hotel and the Murphy-Dolan store, known simply as the House. They sat like twin bastions in the center of Lincoln, commanding both the crossroads and the narrow artery of Main Street. As the sun dropped behind the Sacramento Mountains, Lincoln simmered in the dying light, its Main Street lined with bullet-pocked walls and the acrid haze of spent gunpowder. The 5-day battle had settled into its rhythm, bursts of fire, shouts across the dust, and the long taut silences that came when neither side dares to move first. With the standoff dragging into the late afternoon, Sheriff George Peppin decided to remind the world that his badge still meant something. He called out Deputy Jack Long, handed him a stack of arrest warrants, and ordered him to march down the street and serve them, to arrest Alexander McSween, Billy Bonney, and Jim French right there in the middle of the siege. It wasn't a mission of justice. It was theater, an act meant to convince the watching townsfolk and any soldiers at Fort Stanton that the law still lived in Lincoln. Long stepped into the open, the warrants fluttering in one hand, and shouted towards the McSween house, "Come out, by order of the law." For one suspended heartbeat, the town was silent. Then the Regulators answered. Gunfire ripped through the adobe and sent Long diving for cover. He hit the ground, scrambled to his feet, and ran full tilt back to the house, alive only because the defenders had chosen to warn and not kill him. The warrants he carried were still intact, but so was the proof that no one in Lincoln cared to honor them. For the next several hours, the two sides traded fire at long range. Shots cracked across Main Street in steady rhythm, single rounds answering volleys, then silence. By nightfall, the count stood at close to 100 shots fired, a testament not to courage but to stubborn endurance. Miraculously, no men had fallen. Only the horse in the Wortley corral struck earlier when the first fight broke loose. Smoke drifted over the rooftops as lanterns winked out, one by one. The Regulators stayed tight in their barricaded homes, listening for footsteps in the dark. Across the way, Peppin's men reloaded by candlelight, posting guards at every door. Each side waited for the other to break the silence. The first move, to make the mistake that would draw the next blood. By the time the stars took to the sky, Lincoln was quiet again. No surrender, no victory, just two armies glaring at each other through the darkness, the town between them caught in the crossfire of pride and vengeance. The first day of the siege was over, and though no bodies yet lay cooling in the street, the smell of death was already in the air. When the guns fell silent on the first night in Lincoln, the streets lay empty, quiet but alive with the weight of what had begun. For all the thunder that had rolled through the town that day, the cost in blood was strangely small. No Regulators dead, no bodies cooled in the dust. Only the wounded moans of Peppin's men, scattered and bandaged behind the walls of the house, broke the silence. The Regulators, tucked behind sandbags and adobe, had fought with precision and patience. Their portholes had turned crude houses into fortresses. They'd fired carefully, not wildly. Each shot measured, each risk weighted. It wasn't luck that spared them, it was discipline. The men of McSween's faction knew this wasn't a fight that they could afford to lose. They were defending not just their homes, but the last scraps of justice left to them. Across the way, Sheriff Peppin's alliance, 40 men strong, hardened by range wars and reputation, had charged headlong into the teeth of a well-laid defense. At least 5 of them went down wounded before sundown, reminders that numbers and swagger could not always overcome position and preparation. When dusk came, the attackers stopped firing, not because they chose to, but because they had to. By the ledger of battle, the day belonged to McSween and his Regulators. They held the high ground, the advantage in numbers, and the confidence that came with survival. The townsfolk watching from darkened windows saw a truth the law refused to name, that justice in Lincoln no longer wore a badge, it wore a bandolier. But even in victory, the Regulators knew the walls were closing in. The house men would regroup, more guns would come riding up the road, and the men trapped inside those adobe rooms would soon learn that even the strongest defense can crumble when the fire spreads and mercy runs out. That first night, Lincoln held its breath. The battlefield was quiet, but the war had just found its rhythm. And the law, the real law, the kind that protects rather than punishes, remained nowhere to be found. When the sun went down on July 15, 1878, the smoke still hung low over Lincoln. The street was quiet now, no hoofbeats, no shouting, just the sound of the wind whispering through shattered glass. The first day of the 5-day battle was done, and for all the bullets that had torn through the town, it wasn't blood that defined the day, it was resolve. The Regulators had held their ground, 60 men strong, surrounded, hunted, but unbroken. They turned homes into fortresses and desperation into discipline. Their courage had carried them through every volley, every ricochet, every moment when the law might have come riding down that road, and it didn't. Across the way, Sheriff Peppin's men regrouped in candlelight, tending wounds and counting ammunition. They'd called themselves lawmen, but by nightfall they knew better. They were soldiers now, fighting for a faction that wore power like a badge. Both sides waited in the dark, listening for the next shot, the next scream, the next fire that would light up the valley. Lincoln was no longer a town. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. The law had fled, and what remained were men with guns and grudges, barricaded behind walls of adobe and pride. And as the first stars broke over the black sky, every man in that town knew this wasn't going to end with an arrest. It was going to end with a funeral. Tomorrow would bring more blood, more smoke, and the sound of fire consuming everything left standing. But tonight the victors and the damned shared the same silence, each staring into the night, wondering if they'd live to see the dawn. Out here, justice never came riding. Only men did. Another day ends in Lincoln. One town, two sides, and 1,000 empty promises from a law that never came. Day one was a warning, the thunder before the storm. But by the time the smoke clears, justice in Lincoln County won't be measured in verdicts or warrants, only in who lives long enough to bury the dead.
The Battle of Lincoln isn't just a story of bullets and burned adobes. It's the story of what happens when greed, fear, and politics choke out the rule of law. By nightfall on July 15th, both sides believed they were fighting for what was right. And that's what made it so deadly. Because when everyone thinks they're the good guy, no one ever walks away clean.
The siege has only just begun. In our next episode, we'll walk into day 2, the tightening noose, the failed truces, and the first blood drawn in earnest. For Lincoln, the night between the battles was the last breath before the fire. If you're standing with us at the edge of history, take a moment to like, follow, rate, and review wherever you listen. It helps keep the story alive and the truth from fading into the dust.
You can join our work at darkdialogue.com or reach out with questions, case suggestions, or insights at info@darkdialogue.com. Support our mission by joining the Dark Dialogue Collective, the boots on the ground effort that helps us search, document, and support families still fighting for justice.
Adopt a name, take a case, and keep a story alive through our Adopt a Victim program. You can also support us directly on Patreon, Ko-fi, or Substack. And every share, every listen, every word you spread keeps the truth from being buried.
History remembers the victors, but Gallows and Gunfights remembers the victims and the land that never let them rest.
Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, keep the past talking, and make the guilty face the gallows.